Hey, everybody. Welcome to the wonderful world of Remnant Radio. Dr. Natalie Atwell is with us once again. And today we're talking about grooming practices in the church. What are they? How do we fight against them? All that and more in this program. You guys stay tuned. Hey, everybody. Joshua Lewis here with Remnant Radio. Thank you so much for tuning in to the program. Man, so much stuff going on in Remnant Radio. Best way to stay up to date on all the things Remnant is not to get lost in the algorithms of the YouTube. It's to subscribe to the newsletter. There's a link in the description for remnantradio.com. If you go over there, you'll be able to register for our newsletter, get updates on conferences and courses and all the various things we have going on here on the show. So make sure to do that because we have 2 conferences a year. We've got one coming up in Houston, Texas this fall. We've got one in San Diego, California next spring, and tons of various courses that would help supplement Christian faith, from Christian theology to spiritual gifts and soon coming much more. So you guys stay tuned with all of that there on the newsletter. But without further ado, I want to introduce you to my guest today. This is Natalie, Dr. Atwell. Tell us a little about yourself and your ministry for people who haven't watched our last program.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I am a licensed clinical mental health therapist and a follower of Jesus who practices outside of the Charlotte, North Carolina area. And we get a lot of referrals from churches, from ministries, and from doctors, lots of different people in the area. We've really become a trusted practice to help the hurting in our area. And I attribute that all to the Lord and to hiring really good people.
That's great. I also attribute all of Remnant Radio's success to all the people we have hired. They are much better at doing the things than I am, so I can sympathize with that statement. Tell us, let's dive into it a little bit. Grooming, what is it? The language has been thrown around a lot. I think I told you at the beginning of the program, the word narcissism is being thrown out when it's not applicable. Gaslighting is being thrown around when it's not applicable. That word doesn't mean what you think it means. And grooming is really bad. And I think it's important that we define that term so that we can actually say how heinous it is in relationship to just general sexual immorality. So could you start off by giving us a definition for grooming, and maybe specifically in a kind of spiritual context, ministry context, and how that differs broadly from kind of sexual misconduct at large?
Sure. Grooming, I really like that word because you can think about the analogy of grooming a dog or grooming a cat. You're trimming away things, or you're trying to make it look a certain way. And really that's what happens in the context of grooming in a relational way, is that someone's kind of putting things out there or doing things to a certain person to make them feel like they're special, or they're, in a need of their help, in need of someone's help or leadership in a certain way. So it's really trying to manipulate in such a way that there's a dynamic of, this person needs me to do something amazing in their life. Or in the church context, this person needs me and they need to listen to everything I say without questioning it to elevate them to where God wants them to be.
Okay, that's super helpful. So let's give a ministry context. We've talked about Dr. Michael Brown a little bit off air before the program. There's a seeming difference to the grooming situation that happened there, and I'll let you kind of unpack that for our audience who might not be unfamiliar with the situation there. Give me a contrast between that and a 21-year-old youth pastor who's got a youth leader who's 23 years old, and she's, young and single, he's young and single, and hormones get the better of them. Like, is that at least it could potentially be a grooming situation, but is it the same as what we're seeing in the Dr. Michael Brown situation? If they fall into sexual sin, we all agree that's bad and wrong, but is it the same degree of manipulation that you would see in a grooming situation? And yeah, so help me unpack that, and then I'll have a follow-up question for you.
Yeah, I would argue it's not the same, because you're dealing with 2 young adults who could arguably be considered consenting adults, where they may both have the same feelings of attraction in a sexual way, although they are doing it outside of God's order and plan. That's not necessarily the same thing as grooming, where a leader has a lot of power over someone. There's definitely a difference in the power dynamic when you're talking about a grooming situation, and where the person's kind of under that leadership and they feel like they have to do everything that person says, even if they feel deep down inside that it's not right.
Does the power dynamic define the grooming? Are there situations where like a senior pastor falls into again a sexual relationship with someone at their church, and yes, there's a power dynamic because he's in leadership. Does that equal grooming instantly, or can there be different situations where, yeah, they both just fell into sin? Like, how do you really define that? You mentioned kind of cutting away, whether it be at the conscience. I think in the Dr. Michael Brown situation, we've heard stories of him, kissing this girl on the cheek, calling her daughter, kind of being too handsy with her, holding her hand, slapping her on the butt, those kinds of things that seem to escalate it, desensitize her to some extent. When I hear the term grooming, that's the kind of things I hear about. From your perspective, does every form of power, as it relates to a leadership dynamic, if there's sexual sin involved, is that always grooming, or can there be exceptions to that? I'm curious.
Yeah, I don't think it always is grooming. I mean, there's also the situation where there's a pastor and, a lady comes in for some encouragement and she's in need of her shepherd at that point, and she may come on to him and they fall into sexual sin. So, there's definitely that aspect too. But maybe if let me run down some of the questions that I would ask someone to consider if they thought they were being groomed, and maybe that will help to explain that. Is that okay?
Love it. Yeah.
Okay. So, one is a leader notices you or acknowledges something special in you and begins to give you special attention related to what they see in you, he or she sees of you. Have you been given a platform to elevate your gifts, although you've had zero or minimal training, education, or even mentoring in that area? Another one would be, are you given the impression that you're a part of a special or exclusive group? So that would be the instance in Dr. Brown. A lot of these actually would be, um, like you're one of his daughters or something like that. Another question is, once you've been given more responsibility within that church or group, leaders begin to question authority figures in your life. So they may question your own parents or grandparents or other pastors who've shepherded you, such that it leads to confusion. You might begin to ask questions, but the answers given to you are not always from scripture in ways that you always thought of or were taught before. So you feel like there's been this twisting. At some point, you begin wondering what the leader will say or how the leader will respond more than you consider what God might say. So it's also, have I elevated that person's opinion or authority in my life above all other authority figures, even considering God in some ways? Um, have people left the church or this group? And when they have, are they considered disobedient or not having enough faith? Or maybe they're not called to be a part of a special move happening anymore within that group. If you've questioned or asked for clarification on things, the leader reminds you of his or her call or special authority and then reprimands you, possibly harshly. You could battle confusion between the good you've experienced as a part of the group and the confusion of being hurt by being separated from family or friends that you love. I see that a lot. You battle the inner turmoil of feeling good about the kind words spoken to you and the hurtful ones used in times of correction. If you've considered leaving, you are reminded of the times you've been blessed by kind words, gifts, special treatment, or more by the leader of the group. And then there's also, oftentimes, if you consider leaving, there's a lot of guilt or shame that you might hurt someone if you leave. So those are some typical things that we see if people have been groomed.
I mean, a lot of these sound like cult-ish tendencies, like in cult groups. Like, I want you to question all of your other leaders. I want you to think I have a novel interpretation of scripture that's the right one. I want you to have an in-group and out-group. I want you to see the church as like, this is your core family and everyone outside is against. These are core tendencies that we see in cult groups. How many of those things would you need to check off to say, yeah, because one of them, I'm thinking of one of the first ones you mentioned, a leader gives you special attention and praises you for your gift. I go, man, I hope every church is doing that one, to some degree. Like,
Yeah.
I actually hope that that's happening in your life. But if that is done in conjunction with all of these others, or even three or four of these others, that's really bad, right? Because it is I want you to be dependent on my praise, and I want you to be fearful of my correction. And there's going to be times, depending on, especially if you're in that in group, there's going to be times where correction is being brought. There's going to be times where praise is
Mhm.
brought. So
Yeah.
how do you navigate some of that? How many of those need to be checked off for you to feel like, okay, maybe I'm in this situation?
I probably should create some type of criteria or to diagnose around this. But there are some great people out there, like Diane Langberg, for example, who have created a lot more verbiage around what we would look for. But I would honestly have to look at the story of what's happening. And then it would definitely have to be, I would say, probably 3 to 5 of these in some of the really harsh categories, like the combination of they see something special in you and then they've elevated you before probably they haven't vetted you that much.
Sure, we saw a lot of that with the Mike Bickle situation, where there was people who were just completely
Mhm.
woefully unqualified that were elevated, but it gave them that kind of special attention and praise that allowed a manipulation process to begin, and it was in tandem with a lot of those other things that you mentioned. So I actually see like what you're saying in these questions as informative to that
Mhm.
process, but then I kind of hope that like, if you're already a part of a leadership team, like hopefully some of that stuff is happening, but at the same time,
Yeah.
I can see how it can be utilized in a manipulative way. So give me some of the early kind of warning signs for grooming behavior, specifically in church environments with spiritual leaders. What are some of the things that they're going to begin to initiate to start that grooming process?
Really, the idea of making you feel like you're so special and you're so special to that person because of specific things in ways that no one else is special. So, you're a part of my special group of people here, if that makes sense. So, yes, pastors should be saying amazing things, encouraging people and building them up. We should be doing that within the church, absolutely. But if they're only saying specific things to a certain person and they're elevating them a lot more, they're isolating them in a way. If those, conversations lead to an isolation of someone, I would definitely look at a red flag within that.
Okay, so what would be the kind of the role of emotional dependency, right? I think of Dr. Brown, his situation, referred to himself as a spiritual father, referred to this young lady as his daughter. Some of some of that language, and I've been a part of some cultures at times. I've witnessed some cultures. I'll say it that way. I've witnessed some cultures where the spiritual dynamics at times where you need to go to your pastoral leadership before you get approval for dating someone. I mean, some pretty kind of
Yeah.
cultish like behaviors. If you're gonna, quit your job and go work somewhere else, you really need to run. And I don't think that this is inherently evil to like discuss with leadership and like get wise counsel on whether you should change jobs or whatever. But also, if you're disdained for making a decision with your own personal autonomy for changing job careers or breaking up with someone or marrying someone, like the church doesn't get to dictate what you do. It's totally acceptable to go to the church for wise counsel in those issues. But when those optional counsel opportunities turn into mandatory manipulations, I think there's some kind of destabilization and unhealthy relationship there. So maybe you could talk to me about some of like the spiritual dynamic and spiritual language that's used often in these grooming situations.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of. I think you have to be careful saying. I like the idea of a spiritual father, and I've seen that used really well. And I know some clients who say, "Hey, this guy's been a spiritual mentor to me, a spiritual father to me in a lot of ways," but never abuse it in a way. But I think you have to be, especially as a shepherd and a pastor, you have to be very careful in using that language, especially if you're not referring to everyone in your flock in the same way. I think there are definitely certain distinctions within a church. There's elders, there's deacons, there's, people like that. And I think those are okay terms to use. But I think if you decide to use the term of a daughter or son, then you need to make sure that it applies to everyone under your care and not just specific people. Because if it applies to specific people, then it really opens the door for manipulation to happen because that person feels like they're special, they're one of your people. And it opens you up as a pastor. It also opens someone under your leadership up to be in that position.
Yeah, I've in my own personal walk, I've always felt uncomfortable speaking and even hearing people speak in the kind of, and I hate to say it this way because it sounds so hierarchical and superiority complex,
Yeah.
downward, like this is my spiritual son, this is my spiritual daughter. That's always made me uncomfortable. I always feel
Mm-hmm.
less uncomfortable when a person self-identifies, like, yeah, that they were a mentor to me, like they discipled me, like, oh, that's a spiritual father or mother in my life. I always feel less uncomfortable when it's the other person kind of identifying upward. But also in my own local context, I tell people, don't call me Elder Josh, right? Like and when they say Pastor Josh, I go, just Josh every single time, because it's like, when I was a graphic designer, you didn't call me graphic designer Josh, right? Like, this is just my role. Like, Jesus seems to intentionally speak about people who love being called teacher, who love being called father, and it seems like he's even trying to address that kind of spiritual pride that people actually, and it's such a cultural thing. And I'm not trying to shame anyone who calls their pastor so and
Yeah.
so. I understand it's a sign of respect in the same way I call you doctor when you come on the program. Um, you know, uh, I acknowledge that there are some cultural things that we can be sensitive to, but in my personal context, I've seen those things be so uh, uh, blown out of proportion. I always mispronounce the word I was trying to pronounce. I've been told over and over, that's not how you pronounce that word. Until I can figure it out, I'm just going to say blown out of proportion. I attempt to just affect our language. Like, I'm just Josh. I'm just the guy who stands up and teaches the Bible. And I want you to certainly honor your leadership, respect your leadership as the Scripture directs and instructs. But you shouldn't deify
Yeah.
your leadership. You shouldn't uh, view them more than they should be. And I wonder if you maybe could speak into that. Like, what is a healthy view of leadership that's both biblical, God honoring? We should honor our leadership. We should obey our leadership. But what does that all entail? And when does it like verge on cult like tendencies, that lording authority that Jesus says the Gentiles lord authority over one another? Where's that balance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what really comes to mind is that when a leader like refuses to be questioned, or if you feel like you can't go and ask a question to someone, always following the proper channels. I do believe there's a way to do things in an orderly manner, but I know oftentimes when people get to that place where they feel like they cannot question their leader in a healthy way by saying, "I don't understand this. Can you help me, understand this from scripture?" And or if they won't hear you out, or if you're not allowed to disagree with them, I think that's important. We often forget the value of that within a church setting, that it's okay to disagree on certain things, not the main things, of course, about the gospel, but it's okay to have disagreements at times, and we need to have leave room for that, because if we don't, then we are creating an environment where we're elevating narcissistic leaders or pastors, or developing that even within our own selves. I mean, as a business owner and a leader of a practice, I want my staff to question me. I want them to step on my toes because it makes me better, and I don't know all the answers all the time. Do I have to be the decision maker because it all falls on me from an accountability standpoint at the end of the day? Absolutely. And that's how a pastor is. Like, it all, the shepherding of that is their responsibility. But there are so many pastors, even the ones who aren't necessarily grooming people within their congregation, but they are in a harmful position because they're not allowing healthy conversations to happen. Of, hey, let's question this. Let's let people disagree.
I think that's really important, and I think that's an area that Um, that issue, though, it's not only related to grooming; it relates to all of the issues of about abusive church leadership that we've heard. If the leader cannot be questioned, or if the leader cannot be held accountable, you have a situation that is, it's just, you're sitting on dynamite. It's going to blow up eventually. And if it's not the grooming situation, it's another situation like it. I would advise people, if you're in a church where your leadership cannot be questioned, you need to go to the leadership above them. And if that's impossible, you need to get the heck out of there. If there is no leadership above them, I just, that that's a bomb waiting to go off. So maybe speak specifically to leadership structure for a moment. I know you mentioned elders and deacons. Happens to be the one that I'm the most in favor of. Just viewing the church as run by elders and deacons. I don't use language of pastor, teacher, those kinds of things, because those are gifts, not offices, as I understand them. But could you maybe weigh into how is a church, maybe even beyond the kind of elder deacon dynamics, but just a general church structure that would protect people against these kinds of at least potential risks for grooming and spiritual abuse?
Yeah, I think the idea of keeping it biblical in the lane of a pastor should be a shepherd, and they're really caring after their flock. They're not trying to ward, power over them to manipulate them or to control them in some way. They don't feel threatened by them if they are, questioned or challenged in any way. I think it's very dangerous if you get to the point like we were talking about where you can't be. But I think if the pastor has that heart of a shepherd and they have good elders and deacons who can, serve the congregation well and the elders can question them, I mean, I'm in favor of that model. I'm going to be honest, the times in my practice where I have seen the most harm and spiritual abuse or grooming even happening is when people do elevate themselves to a certain status, whether they call that apostle or a prophet, and I'm kind of with you. I believe there are gifts that people have, and I don't believe the gifts stopped, but I don't think that there is one gift that's elevated over another in such a way that should elicit manipulation or control. But I have seen that happen so often in this area, but definitely in other areas too. And then the sad reality of that is that if you believe, you're a certain apostle over other people and you don't view that as a mentorship or something like that, a lot of people just believe what you say, they won't question it, and then it gives other apostles in the area the right to feel like they can do the exact same thing.
Sure. Yeah. Have you seen, I have no way of defining this, but there is a kind of ecclesiological structure for those listening, ecclesiology, just the study of the church. There's a church structure that I see a CEO kind of model where there's one guy at the top making the executive decisions. As I've been trying to follow all of the abuse stories, even when there are boards of directors or elders or deacons, but when they're essentially covers for a CEO model where there's really just one executive leader and everyone's there to support that specific leader and can't be questioned, that seems to be the one common denominator in all of the, because you can see situations in cessationist Southern Baptist circles, hyper charismatic spaces. The one through line to me seems to be what I've been calling this CEO senior pastor model, where this guy's has that been your experience seeing and witnessing that as the breeding ground for abuse? It's not to guarantee that there will be abuse in that situation, but it seems as
Mm-hmm.
if that's a flourish ground for that kind of abuse to come forth.
Yeah, definitely see what you're saying, and I wish I could say that there was a specific model that tends to lean towards more abusive leaders. But the reality is, people can have a very healthy looking structure, but it can still be very unhealthy. So I've seen it. I've
Totally.
seen you know even like I'm familiar, like I said, with Southern Baptist and charismatic models where I've been in churches who have a board of directors who really don't know what's going on in the church and they don't really have that much decision making power. And so you do sort of have a CEO pastor. But I've also seen, a church where they have deacons who are supposed to be holding the pastor accountable. They kind of function as elders a lot of times in Southern Baptist churches, but the only ones who are allowed to be deacons are the ones who are going to say yes to the pastor. So I've
Sure.
actually seen just be terrible in so many different ways. And really, to be honest, it's convicting to us as members of the church to make sure that we don't allow that to happen, because a lot of times we allow it to happen. We elevate someone, we don't want to question them, we're too busy. And then when it's too late and something's happened, it's horrible.
Yeah, I might send you a document I'm working on for my church on an advisory board to get your thoughts on it, because I suspect in a situation where something happens with our leadership team, should our leadership team be the exclusive voice for determining how justice, gets formed in that. In my thinking, I'm thinking of like putting together an advisory board of members of our church who can weigh through, hey, this is the direction we think we should take on this, and then our elders would then essentially sign off on that, say yes, it's good, and if they disagreed with that, it would go publicly before the church. This is what the advisory board is saying. Our elders think this, but they kind of ultimately give it to a public vote for the church. Because I still think that the elders are supposed to govern the affairs of the church. And I still think that they should kind of adjudicate issues of discipline in some of those senses. But if there is discontinuity between the advisory board, oftentimes what happens is the elder board just kind of, we don't want to do that, get rid of it. And I'm like, that doesn't seem healthy either, because if there's legitimate cover up, the church at least needs to know where that's all fleshed out. So anyway, I'm thinking through some of that, and that's something that I'm wrestling with a lot, because I've seen how some of these things go in churches, and I recognize even if I got hit by a bus, someone else is going to have to take my place, and I want to make sure our church is healthy and safe, whether I'm in leadership or someone else is, trying to do that to the best of our ability. I wonder if you would maybe specifically talk to us about some of the Dr. Michael Brown situation. Brown's return to ministry was supported by elder teams, despite the investigative findings. What safeguards should churches add to evaluate these kinds of situations? I know the Firefly reports have become extremely popular recently, but not every church can afford something like that. So how does a church both investigate and actually hold people accountable with what the investigation finds?
Yeah, I think what happened with a lot of people in that situation, and it hits very close to home because it's in my area. And even though some of the abuse happened in Florida, a lot of those people have moved here. And I think one of the biggest things is people really struggle to think things happened by someone that they love. They struggle to think, man, I love this person. He has really poured into me. He's so wise. He's done so many good things, that they want to overlook the bad, or they want to consider that the bad aren't there. But the reality is, a lot of times people like that have two sides of who they are. They present one way to certain people and one way to another. And also, people aren't technically, I mean, from the world standpoint, we're not all good or bad. You can do a lot of good things. Now, from a biblical standpoint, we are all, completely in need of a savior and sinful, and thank God for Jesus, and we need him. But I think we have to remember that we're still human, and we assume sometime if someone's good, they're all good. And we want to realize that we don't want to assume that they've done these other things. But we have to keep in mind that even people we love who've done amazing things can also have done horrible things. And that's really hard for people to wrap their brains around. So when that person they love, who's done so many amazing things to them, is questioned about harmful things, they don't even want their mind to go there, because then it somehow they think it takes away the good that they've put into them, or they've
Yeah,
helped them.
that makes a ton of sense. Again, I look at the Mike Bickles of the world, or even guys like Mark Driscoll with the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, which was extremely
Yeah.
important for people to listen to. The people who have experienced what I would consider significant spiritual abuse from Mark Driscoll have also praised him for all of the great things and sacrifices and financial offerings and like care that he would actually give people, which made, I think, pushing back against that so difficult and so hard, was because no one is as evil as they could be. And many people have, by God's grace, done a lot of really great things. And by the scheming and destructive power of sin, have committed plenty of heinous acts as well. So I think it's good that we not look at people in this kind of polarized lens. I hate that we are already 20 minutes into this. From a psychological care perspective, and this is super important, I think that we have to address, how do we support both the survivors of grooming, and prevent further scandal in this kind of thing happening in the future? I think it's important that we make sure that we care for those individuals who have been taken advantage of. And I would, hope that the church would, this is one of the things I'm actually really comforted by the Dr. Michael Brown situation, is that one of these women who's come forward, the church actually gathered around her and she found her faith again. Like, she had left the faith, she was cared for, to the point where, man, Christ is the answer. So, like, I think that's, if anything good could have come from this, that was it, right? Where the church actually stood up and responded in a right way and cared for this young lady. But could you maybe weigh into what the church's responsibility is in caring for these women? Well, I say women, they don't have to be women, but victims
Yeah.
of grooming. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things churches can do is talk about it, talk about the fact that it can happen. I think it would be really good for youth groups and for other ministries of the church to have a good open conversation. Even if it was to watch a biblical video at the beginning of their, school year or start of the season of what grooming looks like and what it is and what our policy is at the church or if it happens. I think that's something we don't just need to assume we know what to do as a church or we know how to handle it. Like, put a policy in place, talk about it as a church, because if you talk about it, you're not going to assume that it won't happen there. And that's the mistake that a lot of people have. And then if it does happen within your church, one of the most important things you can do when someone is a victim is to believe them. That's oftentimes why people don't come forward. And that person that you mentioned, I actually am very familiar with that situation. And when people started believing that person's story, is when she came back to the faith because she knew godly people believed her. Because it's one of the most damaging things you can do is not believe people. And now, again, I'm not saying that people don't lie and there's not manipulation in some of that too, but most of the time when people are disclosing something like that, it has taken an extreme amount of courage. So believe them, make space to listen to their stories and ask them, what do you need? How would you like me to respond or address this situation? Don't assume you know what they need or how they want you to respond, and be very cautious about letting them be a part of that process. And if they say, hey, offer counseling and find some good people in your area. Do you need some resources? But like I said, one of the most powerful things you can do is believe. And I think it would be good for churches to have processes in place, have some good conversations around grooming and what this looks like and how we're trying to ward it off as a church. I mean, to be honest with you, my children go to public school, and they had, at the beginning of the school year this year, the entire state made every student watch, I think middle and high school, a video of what grooming is. So why couldn't we do that in the church?
Sure. No, I think that's good because in an environment where everyone knows the language and knows what to fight against, predators don't feel safe in that environment and they move on to another environment. So I think that's a great, like, not only talk about policies, but talking about them in the youth group, communicating them to parents. Hey, this week we're going to be talking about this with your kids. If you feel uncomfortable and you want to have that conversation on your own, you have that conversation with your kids. This is what's happening. I think that's fantastic. With that conversation, when you say trust, or not trust, believe, I also heard you kind of, what I would articulate as a trust but verify, that every single claim against leadership in the church has to be investigated. That doesn't necessarily mean that it needs some kind of expensive, third party investigation for your small, 60 member church, which is like the natural average right now. But that every claim needs to be trusted enough to be investigated. That seems to be the always the right Christian response. People will say, you're not supposed to bring a charge against an elder unless it's by 2 or 3 witnesses. And I go, whoa, 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 whoa. That is if you're executing church discipline, not whether you're going to participate in an investigation. Also, a witness to that could be a text message. A witness could, in the ancient Jewish world, quoting from Deuteronomy, blood on a knife, right? Could be a witness in a testimony or in a case. If there's only, hey, the murder weapon was found in this guy's garage, that's a witness. So you don't have to say that there has to be, 3 victims that come forward before you're willing to investigate. And I think that's an area that the church needs to very much be careful of. I hate that we already have gone 33 minutes into this program. Natalie, thank you so much for jumping on the program for us. Give us a kind of final, where do people connect with you? What's the best place for them to connect with your ministry? To kind of, you got a book coming out on this subject. Where would they find that?
Yeah, I have a book coming out on spiritual warfare and the unseen realm, what's behind humanity with mental health, and that hopefully will come out in the spring of next year sometime. But you can find me on mentalwarriorconsulting.com, and then I have all the social media links and all that, and I can provide those for the show notes as well. And I blog on these
Excellent.
topics and all kinds of stuff. So
Wonderful. Natalie, thank you so much for coming on the program. For those of you who are watching, make sure to follow All Things Remnant Radio in the newsletter over at theremnantradio.com. You can sign up for that and get all of our extra content. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next Monday and Wednesday from 4 to 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. Peace out.